All right, I'm on. So we are going to talk mostly about the autonomic nervous system today. It's wildly complicated. There's a lot of information. I'm going to get through as much of it as I possibly can. I cannot possibly go over every single word, description, detail in a short Zoom meeting. So I'm going to do as much as I can. We will continue with this tomorrow. FYI, Module 5, Week 5 outline and exercises, all of that's been posted. As you probably, I got a notification. So if you want to know what's coming up detailed day by day, just look at the Canvas page, okay? Read that outline. So without further ado, I've been charging my iPencil here. Let's get going. So I'm going to call it my first whiteboard, and we're going to start talking about the autonomic nervous system. So I'm just going to write, just to keep things quick, the autonomic nervous system. Let me drop in another student. This regulates internal body organs and systems. So all of the functions that occur by the autonomic nervous system are going to be internal maintenance things mostly. Just the new people who just dropped in, I'm going to allow you to record if you have it. So back to my lecture. This is still part of what's considered part of the motor division of the nervous system. So autonomic nervous system is still motor. That just means it's still motor efferent. It's just not somatic, going to skeletal muscles. It's not voluntary. It's autonomic. So the effector organs of this system are basically smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Those are the main effector organs. So the autonomic nervous system, this is a two-chain pathway that's different from the somatic motor efferent division. The somatic, which goes to skeletal muscles, is just a single chain, a one neuron pathway, all the way from the central nervous system, axon really long, goes right to the skeletal muscle and innervates it. In the autonomic nervous system, it's always a two-chain pathway. So we have a neuron, just to draw it, emanating from the central nervous system. It synapses with another neuron, which then goes to the effector organ. That's what we mean by a two-chain pathway. We call this synapse the ganglia. Okay, so if you hear me describe in the autonomic nervous system, if you hear me say or you read the preganglionic neuron, it means the first one in this chain. The postganglionic neuron refers to the second neuron in this chain, and the postganglionic neuron always innervates the effector organ. All right, so that's just getting some language out of the way. Now, the cell body of the preganglionic neuron is in the central nervous system. That means it's in the brain or spinal cord. Its preganglionic axon, this thing, synapses with the second postganglionic neuron cell body, right? The postganglionic neuron in this relay, this pathway, has a cell body in the peripheral nervous system. Either close to the spinal cord or far or close to the effector organ. And that differs between sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. We'll talk about that. And then obviously this axon reaches the effector organ. Okay. Preganglionic fibers, that means axons, in the autonomic nervous system are thin and lightly myelinated. So that means in this first neuron in the chain, there's a little bit of myelin around the axon, and it's a very relatively thin axon. That would make these group B fibers that we learned a long time ago. Thin and lightly myelinated. Remember, they conduct impulses about 20 to 30 miles per hour. About 30 miles per hour. The postganglionic fibers, that means the neuron, the second neuron in this chain, this one, and I'm just going to write axons, that's what we mean by fibers. These are super thin, so I'm going to write thinnest, and they are unmyelinated. So they're the slowest, group C fibers. They transmit impulses roughly 2 to 3 miles per hour. Okay. All somatic neurons, the ones that go to skeletal muscles, this is just a comparison. All somatic neurons release acetylcholine as neurotransmitter and are excitatory. So I'm just going to go on. We're doing a comparison now from autonomic to somatic. All somatic neurons, and remember that's a single neuron, no chain, no two neuron chain. All somatic neurons release acetylcholine as neurotransmitter and are excitatory. The autonomic nervous system gets a little more complicated. In the autonomic nervous system, all preganglionic fibers secrete or release acetylcholine. Remember, this is the first neuron in that 2-neuron chain. All preganglionic fibers secrete acetylcholine. Postganglionic fibers, that's the second neuron in that relay or chain, secrete or release either acetylcholine as neurotransmitter or NOR epinephrine. And their effects, that second neuron chain on the effector organ is excitatory or inhibitory. Depending on what, you know this, depending on the type of receptor at the effector organ. So those are some major differences, and they're really important to remember during this whole discussion. All right, next I'm going to quickly go to general functions. We're going to examine now the subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system. You know them as parasympathetic and sympathetic. You already know the names. I'm just going to say division. Both of these, both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic, generally serve the same organs, the exact same organs in the human body. They just have opposite effects. There's a small exception to that. I'll bring that up later. So this one is called, we call this one rest and digest because it's involved with body maintenance functions in general. And I'm just going to list specifically what the parasympathetic does in most cases. Controlled by brainstem and sacral regions of the spinal cord. So cervical, for brainstem, I'm also going to write the word cervical. So anatomically, really quickly, if this is a brain, here's the brainstem and spinal cord. The parasympathetic fibers that emanate from the spinal cord, they come off up here in the brainstem cervical region and down here in the sacral region. So that's where the nerves emanate. Think high and low. And here's the major functions. This is just sort of an outline of the functions. I'll try to get more detail if I have time later. So we get digestion of food. I'm just going to list some of these major functions of the parasympathetic nervous system. Decreases blood pressure, keeps our blood pressure down at a manageable level. Remember, we're talking about rest and digest. Elimination of feces, so getting rid of waste, and urine. Also controls or decreases breathing rate. Keeps our rest and breathing rate manageable. Also decreases heart rate. Our hearts, believe it or not, normally want to beat faster than they do when we are at rest. It is only through the innervation of the parasympathetic fibers on the heart that the heart actually slows down. If you were to cut the vagus nerve, which is a major parasympathetic nerve innervating the heart, if you were to cut that nerve, the heart would automatically speed up. So we get decrease of heart rate, constriction of pupils of the eye, and then I'm just going to put plus genital functions. So there's a main short list of what they do. Now we're going to compare that to sympathetic on the next page. This is referred to as the fight or flight because it largely turns on. Not that it's ever completely off, but it's usually at a very low simmering functional level until we are highly stressed. And then it sort of leaps into action and gets turned on full tilt. So it's referred to as the fight or flight response because it's evolutionarily, it's theorized that this arm or division of the autonomic nervous system was for survival mechanisms. So this is controlled by the thoracic upper lumbar regions of the spinal cord. So here's a brain, brainstem, spinal cord. These fibers emanate in the middle region of the spinal cord. So we already did parasympathetic, that was up here and down here. The sympathetic, I'll use a different color, those fibers originate from the thoracic and L1, L2, upper lumbar regions. So it sort of comes off the middle section of that spinal cord. And here's some of the major functions. And you'll see that most of these just oppose the functions that we already listed for the parasympathetic division. Speeds up heart rate, increases heart rate. Increases breathing rate. Dilates the pupils. Constricts blood vessels serving digestion. I'm just going to put in parentheses most of the visceral organs. Increases blood flow to the heart and skeletal muscles. When I teach in person, I tell students, when you're sitting there struggling to stay awake listening to me lecture, your parasympathetic nervous system is what's really functioning largely. You're digesting whatever lunch or breakfast you had. You're sitting there relaxed. It's a maintenance type of division. If we heard a bomb go off in the building or the fire alarm and we had to jump out of our seats and dash for the exits, this division would sort of take over, and all of these things would start happening in your body uncontrollably, subconsciously. All of these things would happen. I'm going to add a few more. Dilates pupils. I already said that one, sorry. Dilates. It also dilates bronchioles, our air passageways. And I'll write this over here as a sidebar. The sympathetic nervous system stimulates the liver to release glycogen stores. Remember, glycogen is just a stored form of glucose, and that dumps glucose into the bloodstream, where we can use it if we need it for energy in order to run or fight. It also stimulates the adrenal medulla to release adrenaline, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. So the last thing I'm going to write about sympathetic, it also stimulates the adrenal gland, and it's called the adrenal medulla. That just means the middle part of the adrenal gland, to secrete what the street name is adrenaline, but it's epinephrine and norepinephrine. To contribute or enhance all of these effects. That's a generalization of the functions of those two systems. Now we're going to look at more anatomical differences. I already talked about where the fibers emanate for sympathetic, and I'm just going to show you really quickly, and parasympathetic. Okay, so now I'm going to go on to a new board and start getting a little bit more detailed about the anatomical differences between the two. So let's just talk about parasympathetic fibers. We know that they emanate from what's called the craniosacral region. So therefore, sometimes this subdivision is called the craniosacral division of the nervous system, because it just tells you where the fibers come off of the spinal cord. The ganglia, that means that synapse between the pre and post synaptic neuron, or the pre-ganglionic neuron and the post-ganglionic neuron, that synapse, that junction in the parasympathetic division, ganglia lie close to or in the effector organ. That means, what that tells us, so I'm going to write therefore, preganglionic fibers are long and post-ganglionic fibers are short, very short. So I'm just going to draw a quick example. There's a brain, spinal cord. This is a parasympathetic fiber, so I'm just going to draw a fiber emanating from up here. Whatever organ it goes to, that synapse, the first fiber, the cell bodies in the central nervous system, the preganglion fiber, and it goes all the way out almost to the organ, or actually into the wall of the organ, where its synapse is. There's a ganglia with then a short fiber that actually innervates the organ itself, okay? The cranial part, the cranial area, or I think your book says the cranial part, that means the fibers in this area up here. We're just going to describe where they go and a little bit about what they do. The oculomotor nerve, what it does is it constricts pupils and bulges our lenses for focusing on things that are close to us, like reading a book. The facial nerves, these are cranial nerves, by the way. The facial nerves activate mostly glands in the face region in the head. So I'm just going to list them. Activate nasal, some salivary, and lacrimal glands. Those are tear ducts. There's just two more. The glossopharyngeal, or pharyngeal, however you want to say it. It's also a cranial nerve. Let's just underline these. The glossopharyngeal nerves, the reason I'm saying nerves, not just one, is because there's always one on the right and one on the left emanating from the spinal cord. These specifically innervate what are called the parotid, P-A-R-O-T-I-D, salivary glands. Those are the glands that are located right at the turn of your mandible, sort of right in front of and just below your ears. And finally, I'm going to squeeze this on just because I don't want to leave this on a page by itself. The vagus nerve. This is the main parasympathetic nerve, vagus nerves. So we've got cranial area. We've got oculomotor, myofascial, glossopharyngeal, and the fourth one are the vagus nerves. These are the big guys. Volumetrically, they contain about 90% of all preganglionic parasympathetic fibers. I'm going to run out of space here, so I am going to have to go on. So let me lay over this. I'm just going to continue with vagus. All right, vagus continued. These nerves serve just about every organ in the visceral area. So every organ in both the chest, the thoracic, and abdominal cavities. So the vagus specifically innervates these areas. I'm just going to list them. The cardiac plexus. Whenever you see the word plexus, just think of like a nest of nerve branches. It's just sort of conglomeration of nerve branches. So the cardiac plexus obviously would serve the heart. The pulmonary plexus is just a nest of branches that serves the lungs. And then the esophageal plexus not only serves the esophagus, it sort of wraps around the esophagus, but then it extends down, sort of wraps around the aorta when it plunges into the abdominal cavity, and then serves most of our abdominal organs. Let me just mute somebody. There we go. So the esophageal plexus, back to this, it rides down the esophagus and gives rise to branches that innervates then the liver, gallbladder, stomach, small intestine, and part of the large intestine, the proximal, the top part of the small intestine. I'm just going to write proximal, large intestine, and the pancreas. So you can see the vagus is wildly important at supplying innervation to just about everything in our chest and in our abdomens. So that wraps up the cranial part of the parasympathetic. Now I'm going to talk about the sacral part. I'll try to squeeze it in the sacral division or area of the, we're still talking about the parasympathetic nervous system division. This innervates the lower distal end or part of the large intestine and urinary bladder, the ureters, which are the tubes that run from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. That shouldn't have an S after it. Urinary bladder. And finally, the genitals, male and female reproductive organs. Okay, so now you know what this parasympathetic, what these fibers do, the ones up here and the ones down here in the sacral region, where they go. And remember, this is maintenance stuff. So this is stimulating things like digestion, elimination of waste, yada, yada, yada. Time to layer onto a new board and go to the sympathetic division. division. Remember, this is fight or flight. It's never completely turned off. Both systems are always on. That's a bit of a misnomer or misconception. Yes, when we are relaxed and in our daily routines, our parasympathetic functions are more turned on than our sympathetic functions, and vice versa. When we're totally stressed or rigorously exercising or super excited about something, our sympathetic division gets ramped up, but it's never completely off. Remember, the fibers originate in the thoracic region. That's pretty much from T1 all the way down to L2. And this is when I said back, when I said that both subdivisions innervate the same organs, just have opposite effects, that's 99% true. These are the exceptions. So these organs are the few that are only served by the sympathetic and not both sympathetic and parasympathetic. And those are sweat glands. So every time you start to sweat, either when you're nervous, stressed out, or when you're hot as a cooling process, that's only the sympathetic division that's working there. Also, those erector pili muscles that are associated with each hair follicle in the skin that give us goosebumps when we're cold and make our hair stand up on end, and smooth muscles in the walls of blood vessels. Those are also only under sympathetic control. So here's the deal with blood vessels. When the sympathetic division gets turned on, these smooth muscles either contract or relax, which causes constriction and dilation of our blood vessels. That allows blood to be shunted or diverted to certain areas of the body and restricted from other areas when we're stressed out. Okay. So I'm going to talk more about the sympathetic division. I think I said this about the parasympathetic. It's called the craniosacral division. You might hear or read that the sympathetic is called the thoracolumbar division. I don't use these terms when I speak, but you might read those. That's just delineating where those fibers come off of in an anatomical context. The cell bodies of the first neurons, the preganglionic neurons in that pathway, they're located in the central nervous system. I'm just going to put that in parentheses. Are specifically located in the lateral horns of gray matter of the spinal cord. Are in lateral horns, which is why we learned that anatomy with the last section of gray matter in the spinal cord. Regardless of the precise location of the synapse, that ganglia, the ganglia in this, your book goes into this whole very complicated, detailed explanation of where the ganglia are located. I don't want to tell you to completely skip that section because it's important, but I'm not as concerned that you learn the precise location of these ganglia as much as that you mostly remember that the preganglionic fibers are close to the spinal cord. I mean the ganglia, that synapse, the ganglia, I'll write this synapse with post fiber. Ganglia are located close to the spinal cord. So in contrast, I don't know if you remember, I drew this for the parasympathetic division. There's the spinal cord. We're going back to parasympathetic right now. The first fiber is really long, and the second fiber is really short. In the sympathetic, what we're saying is this. The first fibers are generally short, and the post-ganglionic fibers are longer that go to the effector. So it's opposite in length of the pre and post ganglionic fibers. This term, I'm still talking about the sympathetic nervous system. I'm going to put this in quotes. Rami or rami communicantes that's just Latin, refers only to the sympathetic nervous system communicating branches. So these are that term refers to branches of if you hear me say communicantes or rami communicantes, these are branches of sympathetic. Sorry, I'm trying to write faster than I can. Okay. Now, sympathetic communicating branches, we don't use this term at all for parasympathetic. There are two types of communicantes or branches, what we call white communicantes, and these just refer to that the branches, the fibers in these branches are myelinated. So it's just fancy words for a very simple concept. And we use gray, guess what, for unmyelinated. And therefore, white communicantes or branches would transmit impulses faster than the gray ones. Now I'm gonna, just like we did with the parasympathetic nervous system, I'm gonna just delineate out branches of the sympathetic, where they go, and generally what they do. So this is still sympathetic, so I'll write that out because we don't have the previous board with us. I'm just gonna write sympathetic branches / fibers and their effectors. So the ones serving the head, they still emanate from the thoracolumbar region, but they end up serving the head. And here's largely what they do. Dilate pupils. They inhibit those glands that the parasympathetic stimulated. So they inhibit nasal salivary glands. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you've been extremely nervous, like you had to give a speech in front of a bunch of people. You might notice that your mouth gets really dry. That's why, because your sympathetic nervous system is kicked in and it's inhibiting your salivary glands. Sympathetic stimulation also opens the upper eyelid so that we can see better. And finally, these branches serving the head also can send impulses to the heart. So the main fibers coming off of the upper region of the sympathetic does all of these functions. Let's go on to the branches serving the thorax, mostly the chest. These, I'm just going to write, largely come off the same region, but go T1 all the way down to like T10 area. Not that far, I don't think. Like T6. These are going to serve all the organs in our chest. Here's what they do. So these also serve the heart, like some of the upper fibers. Serve the aorta, the lungs, predominantly the aorta when it's in the thorax region. Esophagus. These are the major organs found in the chest. The thyroid gland, and most, meaning the number, the total number of these fibers, serve the skin. So all of the sympathetic fibers serving all of our sweat glands all over the body are coming off of a branch from the thorax, or serving the thorax region. They also serve the skin. Getting close to the end, guys. Finally, branches of the sympathetic system serving the abdomen. I'm squishing this in here so that perhaps I don't have to go to a new board. This would be, there's overlap, by the way. So this would be from about T5 area all the way down to L2. These form what we call the splanchnic plexus. So I told you, when you see the word plexus, just think of sort of a nest of branches. Splanchnic refers to our visceral abdominal cavity, the visceral organs in our abdominal cavity. So when you take AMP2, there's also something called the splanchnic circulation, which are branches off of the aorta that serve the stomach, the spleen, the small intestine, the upper large intestine. So splanchnic, just think abdominal region, particularly upper abdominal region. Plexus, think of just a nest of nerve branches. So what these are going to serve, it's going to innervate the stomach, intestines, except the distal part. There's an exception, except the lower or distal part of the large intestine. The liver, spleen, kidneys. So these don't, I just caught myself, these don't go all the way down to L2. These only go to like T11, I think T11, T12. So at the very base, our vertebrae, there's 7 cervicals, so those are the C's. Then there's 12 thoracic. and then 5 lumbar. So there is overlap with these. T1 through T6 would be in this region. And then T5, there's overlap is my whole point of this. Going down to T11/T12 would be here. And then finally, the branches serving the pelvic region, the sympathetic branches of the pelvic region are going to run, there's an overlap here from about T10 down to like L2 right here. So this is all sympathetic neurons. We've talked about what these do. We just listed what these do and where they go. Finally, we're going to list this region of the sympathetic fibers. So serving the pelvis, which is inferior to the abdomen. I'm just going to write about T10 to L2. These fibers mostly inhibit functions of organs. Muscles and glands of, I'm going to run out of space, of mostly inhibit, not completely. So all of our visceral organs largely are inhibited when the sympathetic nervous system kicks in by the fibers that are coming off of the T10 to L2 region. So that makes sense. When you're resting and digesting, parasympathetic is mostly turned on, and that's digesting food, kidney function, emptying of the kidneys, the fluid formation of urine into the urinary bladder, and then voiding that to get rid of it, defecation of feces. But when we are severely stressed or excited or exercising, a lot of those functions are turned off, are inhibited, or greatly inhibited, because we need our blood and our functions to do other things in the body. So I think that's all I was going to cover today, which is good. Wow, I got through in 50 minutes. And before I just call it completely quits, I'm going to do a quick review in pictorial form of the anatomy of these fibers. Somatic fibers, these, remember, voluntary skeletal muscle. They look something like this. Multipolar neurons, really long axons that are thick and heavily myelinated. So super fast transmission speed. Somatic, voluntary skeletal muscle. These always release acetylcholine. They're always excitatory. And they innervate only voluntary skeletal muscle. Axon diameter is thick, heavily myelinated. So super fast transmission speed, so we call these group A fibers. This is a quick review. Cell bodies are located in the central nervous system, and their axons extend all the way to the muscle that they innervate. It's a one neuron chain. Actually, there is no chain. It's a one neuron system. Those are somatic fibers. Now we're going to look at the autonomic fibers. So I'm going to draw a big line across here. and write ANS, and first parasympathetic. This will help you if you can picture this in your brain when you hear all of these words. Still, a multipolar neuron originates in the central nervous system. It's thinner, but relatively long, not as long as these up here. There's a ganglion or synapse connection point with a postganglionic neuron. So I'm going to draw another cell body, not as many dendrites typically around it, and a short, super thin. This would be the effector organ. This preganglionic, lightly myelinated axon. So I'm just going to write thin, light myelin. This still originates in the central nervous system, just the cell body. This connection point is in the peripheral nervous system somewhere, that ganglion. So thin, light myelin, this one would be a group B fiber. This right here, no myelin, so it's unmyelinated. In the parasympathetic division, it's short. This guy, the first one, always releases acetylcholine right here in this synapse. This one, the postganglionic fiber, secretes acetylcholine, but is either excitatory or inhibitory depending on the receptor type at the effector. Okay, now let's do sympathetic fiber. Trying to squeeze these all on one page. We've got cell body still originating. It's not letting me draw down there. Still originating in the central nervous system. This is a very short fiber. It's also thin, lightly myelinated. Thin, lightly myelinated group B fiber. So this goes with this as well. It also releases acetylcholine here, and it synapses with a postganglionic fiber that's relatively long, thin, unmyelinated. So it's also a group C fiber. So I'm going to write group C fiber. That would apply to this one and this one. The neurotransmitter coming out of here is norepinephrine. Not acetylcholine. And it also can be excitatory or inhibitory, depending on the receptor at the effector. So that's a quick review of the basic anatomical differences between somatic fibers, voluntary skeletal muscle, autonomic fibers, parasympathetic, and sympathetic. I know that's a lot of business, and it looks like a big mess when I step back and look at it, but hopefully it will help you make sense of delineating the similarities, like they originate in the central nervous system, but mostly differences. This is one neuron, thick axon, heavily myelinated, always acetylcholine, always excitatory, always to voluntary skeletal muscle. Group A fibers just because they're super fast. Parasympathetic originate in the central nervous system, relatively long, kind of thin fiber at the preganglionic fiber. Thin fiber, lightly myelinated, considered a group B fiber. Always releases acetylcholine here at the ganglion, which is in the peripheral nervous system. The postganglionic fiber is typically short, thin, no myelin, group C fiber, and it releases acetylcholine onto its effector organ and can be either excitatory or inhibitory based on the receptor. I know it sounds like this is crazy, like how can I remember all this stuff? It's only because it was pounded into my head in graduate school. Sympathetic central nervous system fibers also originate in the central nervous system. So all three, those are similarities. These are very short, thin, lightly myelinated group B fibers that release acetylcholine onto their postganglionic fiber, which is thin, long, unmyelinated group C fiber, which secretes or releases norepinephrine as its neurotransmitter onto its effector, and it's either excitatory or inhibitory based on the receptors at the effector organ. All right, guys, I'm done. I'm out of breath, and I'm going to stop my recording here